How do we deal with a wolf in sheep's clothing? If that's a question you never had to ask yourself, then I envy you. A wolf in sheep's clothing refers to something, often a person, that appears friendly and harmless, but is in fact hostile and even dangerous. And it's a bitch to tackle, especially when the person in question is an online personality who has spent years, even decades, cultivating a brand of softness, empathy, and kindness. When that's the default perception everyone has of an individual, it's difficult to convince people to look at your evidence to the contrary, or even listen. But what else can you do? On that note, let's talk about non-binary YouTuber Luxander. Though before we can do that, I just need to give a content warning for the following: ableism, domestic abuse, childish sexual assault, gaslighting, transphobia, and transmisogyny. If you like our work, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on social media like Twitter and Discord. So to understand the significance of Luxander's actions and just how harmful they are, we need a little background. For a detailed breakdown, I suggest checking out the previous video in this series, which covered how Vorsh's prodigy, Xanderhal, attempted to exploit my history as a survivor of domestic abuse and childhood sexual assault as his sole piece of evidence that I, in turn, must be an abuser. There's also a video going over the way ContraPoints defended her hero's public acts of domestic abuse, and whilst I certainly suggest it for greater understanding, it's not really vital to today's video. What really matters are Xanderhal's actions. To give a quick recap, in response to me criticising Xanderhal's transphobic and ableist behaviour towards half a dozen non-binary trans folk, he resorted to dragging out my history as a survivor of domestic abuse and childhood sexual assault. He presented this alongside the cycle of violence, a model that seeks to explain cross-generational violence, making the assertion from there that, because victims of abuse are more likely to go on to abuse others, this was enough evidence to conclude that I had an abusive personality disorder. By the way, that isn't a real thing. This is, of course, armchair psychology, a violent act that causes immense psychological harm to its victim. Because not only is it declaring someone mentally ill in an incredibly ableist society, it's a complete dismissal of the person's autonomy. Xanderhal was attempting to erase my agency, arguing that my criticism of him and Natalie was not the result of their transphobia and abuse apologetics, but rather was me lashing out because of the abuse I'd suffered at the hands of someone else. Xanderhal was stripping me of everything that constituted who I am, reducing me down to my abuse, defining me by it. And he didn't do so in the misguided attempt to assist in devising and applying a mental health treatment plan, but as a cheap means of discrediting my voice, violating some of the most traumatic experiences I have ever suffered in order to win what he saw as a debate. And during all of this, Luxander was present, cheering him on. The first time we see this is during Xanderhal's initial attempts around 1 hour and 34 minutes into his stream, though I'll skip to around 1 hour and 37 minutes as he repeats his position clearly.
Is there anything else that we want to cover? Do we have like any of I think there's one more. Don't do armchair psychology. Listen, armchair psychology is usually a bad thing, but I feel I've done enough research and I've had enough personal experience in this situation to be able to speak somewhat authoritatively on this. Yeah, no, I've dealt with abuse in the past. I know how it affects you, and I've done enough research on the cycle of abuse to know that there's probably a good chance that essence of thoughts abuse, which they've alluded to, probably has affected their current mental state. I really don't think that is like a bad take. Do you actually disagree with this? I think you need to be more careful with your wording. As a psychologist, you absolutely don't. You can say it's abusive, but you can't attribute it to a personality disorder. Wait, do you actually disagree? Survivorship bias? You know, maybe it is survivorship bias. Do you think that your abuse has affected your mental state? Absolutely. Oh yeah, 100%. Of course. 100%.
At which point, Luxander chimes in with, quote, "Fucking lol, yes, of course it does," end quote. What's really interesting about this specific situation is a way in which a portion of Xanderhal's audience was already questioning his attempts to armchair diagnose me, and rather than speak in support of that criticism or simply keep quiet, Luxander went out of their way to reassure Xanderhal of what he was doing, telling us that they were laughing out loud as they did so. But it gets worse, since Xanderhal offered his audience, Luxander included, an out. He literally tells them that if they want him to stop resorting to armchair psychology, he'll stop resorting to armchair psychology, only for Luxander to encourage him, telling him to, quote, "Do it, Xandy," end quote, when he suggests making another pass at exploiting my history as a victim of domestic and child sexual abuse. Again, watch the chat as Xanderhal mentions bringing out paint.
When I saw Piggy going for more people, that's when I stepped up, because it was impacting the community as a whole. And I couldn't...
Okay, no, it wasn't. Literally all of my fans were like backing me up, and there were like 5 people that were going after me. Just say Nazis suck more. Nazis do suck. God damn. Armchair psychology is cringe. Okay, you know what, guys? If you guys really fucking hate armchair psychology, I will abstain from the armchair psychology then, alright? Fuck it. I apologize, chat. Jesus Christ. God damn. Now I can't post this on YouTube because Essence of Thought's gonna clip that and be like, ha! Even Xanderhal's own audience agrees with me. Good job, chat. Nice. Because I've known more than one person with it, and only one of them was a violent person, dipshit. Wait, what? Violent? Wait, what are you talking about? I haven't accused Essence of Thought being violent? Oh, you were talking to someone else. Okay, alright. Okay. Now, I think my main point... Hold on. Can I, like... Emily, just ban them. If they're a ban-evader, just ban them. Okay. Can I try to rephrase my position in the most concise way possible so you guys understand what I'm talking about here? Because I feel like my take isn't very controversial and there's just a miscommunication happening. Can I try to do that very quickly? Can I do that really quick? I'm going to bring out paint, all right?
Can we just pause to acknowledge the degree of familiarity on display with Luxander referring to Xanderhal as Xandy? That and the laughing out loud scene earlier show very clearly just how Luxander viewed the situation, a fact we'll be returning to later. The main takeaway from all of this, however, is the fact that Luxander was goading Xanderhal on as he violated my history as a survivor to argue that my criticism of his ableism and transphobia could simply be written off as the incoherent ramblings of the mentally ill. Xanderhal didn't need to be given permission to take another swing at armchair diagnosing me, but Luxander chose to encourage it anyway. And yeah, they tried to save face about it later by helping Xanderhal land a piss-poor excuse, but the damage had already been done, thanks in no small part to their hand. Luxander's involvement was not passive, but active. Luxander chose to stand with Xanderhal when other members of his audience chose to speak out. This is not guilt by association. Luxander is culpable, not simply for what was done to me, but for what Xanderhal has gone on to do to so many others in the trans community. I was one of Xanderhal's early experiments when it came to seeing just how far he could push things in exploiting the trauma of trans people. And it's tokens like Luxander, people who are more than happy to throw the rest of us under the bus for their own personal gain, that taught Xanderhal that he'd not only get away with it, but would be praised for it. The sad fact is, I'd previously blocked Luxander after we butted heads over Natalie, with full intent to unblock once the trauma she dragged up had healed and I was in a better place to talk to them. I'd done nothing to provoke them behind said block, and yet they clapped, laughing out loud and demanded an encore as Xanderhal abused me. My desire to reach out to them when I was ready died with that. Now I was waiting to see if Luxander would ever apologise for what they'd done, which they never did. Instead, I got to watch as Luxander positioned themselves as part of the new anti-abuse movement, without ever reconciling with the fact that they'd very publicly supported someone abusing me. Now, later we'd come to know that the new movement was no different to the last, it was simply the friendship circle which had changed. But back then, I actually had hope. It felt like a genuine paradigm shift. Both Xanderhal and Riley scrubbed all evidence of their abuse of me as they were being called out for their attempts to reform Calvin Garrett's image at the expense of his victims, some of whom were still being targeted in videos he hadn't even taken down. But it was a double-edged blade, since every time I saw this happening and got a little bit of that hope, I was also forced to acknowledge Luxander's part in all of this in spite of what they'd done to me. So I brought it up whilst talking to someone who claimed I had an issue with every other trans YouTuber, pointing out that the only trans people I'd criticised were openly transphobic, Blair White, Rosa Dawn, or were abusers or abuse enablers, Riley Grace Rochon and Luxander, leading my stalker to tag a bunch of people in an attempt to start shit. That's when I saw someone ask about what had happened, so I responded, stating that quote, "Right. When Xander tried to use my history as a survivor of domestic abuse as evidence that I had an abusive personality disorder, they got shut down the first time, only to ask for another pass. Luxander was one of the few people that cheered him on." End quote. I also linked timestamped evidence that showed this, to which Luxander responded,
"If this is your entire justification for calling me an abuser/enabler, then my risk assessment for being around you was correct, and I'm going to go back to forgetting you exist."
What else am I supposed to call you? Luxander repeatedly egged on an abuser as they violated my trauma in a cheap attempt to armchair diagnose me, laughing out loud as they did, like it was some great comedy show. I'd literally linked video evidence of them enabling an abuser, yet they had the gall to downplay that. As already seen, nothing I said was an exaggeration. However, Luxander wasn't going to let this sit and took to posting to their own wall about me.
Can I just say, I wasn't a fan of how Xan talked about EOT. I maintain friendly relationships with people I disagree with because sometimes, when y'all are pissed off, they actually listen to me. EOT didn't talk to me before publicly calling me an abuser/enabler, and frankly, I stopped affiliating with them because of exactly this: catastrophizing and using the worst possible language without even checking with me about what happened. I don't trust them because they aren't safe to be around. Now they're doing to me what they've always done: shit talk me from behind a block to other trans people who won't double check. Did anyone care that I stopped talking to Xan nearly so much around that time? Does anyone care what I actually think? This shit is so fucking terrifying. I'm only just now trying to make friends in these communities again because of exactly this.
To which Korviday responded with,
"I don't think qualifying them as unsafe is fair. Literally one of Xanderhal's biggest victims, and were ruthlessly smeared by him for months. He went so far as to diagnose EOT with abusive personality disorder, used EOT's history with sexual abuse to justify it. That is a lot.
Only for Luxander to reply with,
Okay, well, they're trying to cut me off from the broader trans YouTube community right now, and I've seen them do it before.
So Korviday made the final attempt to help them understand, stating that,
I think that they are deeply hurt by what Xanderhal did to them, and are deeply hurt that other trans creators seem to be fine with what he was doing at the time.
First of all, can we just stop and acknowledge that even now, as I was pushing them on this, the most they say about Xanderhal's actions in exploiting my history as a survivor of childhood abuse and sexual assault was that they weren't, quote, a fan, end quote. They just flat out refused to say clearly that it was wrong, that it should never have happened. Instead, they just say that it wasn't to their personal taste, as if this were on par with a conversation about ice cream flavors. This seems to be part of Luxander's larger attempt to downplay the harm of their actions. Xanderhal did something that, if he were a professional, is so fucking violent that he would have had his license revoked for violation of medical ethics. And Luxander cheered him on. That is the degree of harm we are talking about. And yet, apparently, this demonstrable fact is me catastrophizing. It's amazing to see just how quickly, after being turned into Natalie's pet, becoming part of the Dirtbag left, Luxander started resorting to the alt-right's tactics of, oh, these hypersensitive SJWs. Because, make no mistake, that is what they're doing here. I was publicly abused by Xanderhal. They encouraged it. And now that they're being called out on it, they're pretending like that abuse was nothing. As for, did anyone care that I stopped talking to Xan nearly so much around that time? Even they can't bring themselves to say that they stopped entirely, because they were still very publicly involved with Xanderhal. So that's a lie even their own fans would likely catch if they made it. In regards to me trying to cut them off, funnily enough, nowhere in any of my posts did I specify any sort of action. All I ever did was show people evidence of what Luxander had done. If they jump from me showing evidence of their actions to me trying to cut them off, that shows a guilty conscience on their part. It shows that they know what they did to be unacceptable, and they seem to have a pretty good idea of what people's response to finding out about their actions should be, so much that they're blaming me for it. Also, why should I care about their relationship to Xanderhal after they'd helped him hurt me? Does their distancing themselves from Xanderhal magically undo the psychological trauma he put me through at their request? No, they haven't done anything to fix the damage they caused. Yet they act as if not talking to Xanderhal every day is evidence that proves, I don't really know what, that they're a better person? Fact is, as much as you make it sound like you were being held prisoner as part of Xanderhal's audience, that just doesn't match up with what you were saying at the time. Take this clip for example, which shows Xanderhal rallying his tokens, demanding that they give his transphobic abuse a free pass.
Hold on, type 1 in chat if you're trans and you feel comfortable in my Discord. Like when you go in there, you don't feel like you're going to be attacked by transphobes.
Luxander was so desperate to show everyone just what a good ally Xanderhal really is, that they were the second person to respond. Whilst it's true that this came before Xanderhal Armchair diagnosed me, the fact remains that Luxander was not one of the people who called Xanderhal out for his actions. Luxander was one of the most vocal people supporting him and even helped him in trying to land a save when the rest of his audience weren't having it. So even if they did interact with Xanderhal less following the incident, that doesn't absolve Luxander of their part in all this. Luxander was not a neutral observer, they were part of the violence. If they had any moral integrity, they should have sought to right the wrong they caused. A fact that was pointed out in my response to the previous thread, in which I stated that, quote, "It's called an apology owed, not an apology bought by coming to you begging on my hands and knees." In the post I linked, knowing you would see it, I said 2 things. 1. You instantly regretted your fuck up. 2. You had yet to apologize. You then chose to double down. End quote. To which they replied with,
Not even a, hey, what the fuck, at the time. No one is telling you to beg. That's the same extreme language you always use.
So I pointed out that, quote, "Could I have possibly been suffering from having someone exploit the facts that I was abused and raped as a child to argue that I, in turn, must have an abusive personality disorder, part of an ongoing smear campaign? For all your mewling, did you ever stop to ask what I thought? The fact is, you claim to have known it was wrong at the time, in spite of the fact that, after you regret your call, you tried to help him land his watery ass save. Never did you use your platform to say he'd gone too far. Never did you approach someone to get me an apology." End quote. What followed was silence from Luxander. Instead, all I received was the following reply from one of Luxander's fans, telling me to quote, "Shut the fuck up. A didn't even fucking do anything and you tried to publicly bully him into apologizing? Try to get him harassed for no fucking reason? Suffer 1,000 ulcers, you useless trash heap filth." End quote. Luxander did not speak out against this, by the way. Instead, they turned to creating another post in which they sought to demonize me. This one's a long one, so we're going to have to deal with this in sections. So, in that post, they stated,
I'm going to provide clarification by giving the statement I could have given at the time and add to it with new perspective. Pretend it's 2020 and that this isn't totally out of character for me. 2020. I've been familiar with Essence of Thought, EOT/Ethel in this thread, since before Xanderhal made content about them. My relationship to each of them is, EOT and I have exchanged professional correspondence about videos, and Xanderhal has acknowledged me during streams. My prior knowledge of Ethel began sometime shortly before their very public conflict with rationality rules regarding trans women in sports. It was during the RR conflict that I realized that, even when I think she's right, her tactics are extremely off-putting to me. As an abuse survivor myself, now officially diagnosed with PTSD, I can understand Ethel's desire to help people who are faced with injustice. And also as an abuse survivor, I identified them as a person who I couldn't safely publicly criticize or affiliate with.
Okay, let's talk about what happened with rationality rules, specifically in the lead up to the ACA coup, since that's the point at which Luxander claims they became afraid of my methods, which they state later on in this thread. So, on the 30th of March 2019, Rationality Rules published a video on trans athletes that painted them as a serious danger to women's sports, going so far as to say shit like the following.
And I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport. I don't want to see the day when women's athletics is dominated by Y chromosomes, but without a change in policy, that is precisely what's going to happen.
He also painted targets on the backs of multiple trans women, including 2 black schoolgirls, one of whom no longer participates in sports because of the abuse she received. Now, I saw the danger inherent with what was going on. I'd been part of the sector community through Gamergate, which was largely centered on many of its members, and I tried to survive as a newly out trans person by staying as small and inoffensive as possible. And look where that got us. So this time, I stepped up. When dozens of trans people contacted me, mostly former fans of Rationality Rules, many of whom had donated to his card game Kickstarter, and they literally begged me to take a stand, I did. I went through Woodford's video, showing how his science was completely invalid, how he'd misrepresented every case he discussed, and warned him that his actions carried the potential to cause real harm to the trans community. that his work added to the growing reservoir of anti-trans hatred, which, if left unchecked, could have disastrous results for the trans community. And we all know just how true that turned out to be. Now, after a tense first day, Woodford claimed to have realised he was wrong and told everyone that he'd fix his mistakes, so I gave him the space to do that over the next month. Nothing happened. His video continued to pump out anti-trans propaganda, and he went on a couple of shows whilst visiting the atheist community of Austin. Completely unrelated to me, numerous trans viewers saw that and filed complaints with the ACA, which had until then supported the LGBT+ community. The board met, they agreed that they'd failed and should have either waited until Woodford had addressed the harm he'd caused or discussed it on the show. They apologised and released a statement of solidarity with the trans community, a move which resulted in Woodford comparing himself to fucking Galileo, someone who was rather famously correct. So I spoke up about the fact that Woodford apparently had time to make a sobfest video about how mean the ACA had apparently been to him, whilst his video pumping out literal anti-trans hatred was still up. Now, my response is publicly available, so please, go and see for yourself whether my methods went too far. If you believe that to be the case, then be sure to tell me how I crossed the line, giving specifics. Specifics are particularly important to me as a trans-femme non-binary person who was assigned male at birth. A big part of transmisogyny is the social prejudice that assumes all trans people who are assigned male at birth are aggressive, invasive monsters, the result of which is that a person doesn't have to demonstrate how the actions of someone like me apparently cross the line. They just have to say they do, and society is already primed to believe them. It's similar to calling a gay man a paedophile without evidence or proof. We'd hope that in a just society, people would see that for what it is and just ignore it. But we don't live in a just society, we live in a shitty one. What's more is that this is something a Luxander should be acutely aware of due to their work around the trans community. So I'm having a hard time seeing this as anything but a deliberate attempt to exploit transmisogyny surrounding the events of 2019, where me being even the slightest bit angry at people calling for direct violence against the trans community over a period of 6 months is taken as evidence that I am a monster who cannot be trusted. What really hurts is that this isn't the first time. For those who don't know, my efforts in 2019 were put a stop to when a white upper-class cis woman who had spent months harassing me whilst I had her blocked called on her 100,000 subscribers to circumvent that block and harass me, only to cry stalker when I clapped back on my own wall in response. The very same wall she could not see because I had her blocked. Because, in spite of her being the aggressor at every step of the way over the past 3 months, she was a crying cis woman and I was an exhausted trans femme. Ergo, I was deemed guilty by default. That is what Luxander was knowingly and willingly tapping into. And it wouldn't be the only time they did so either.
That decision was made before Xanderhal pitched into the conversation. It is consistent with my previous actions distancing myself from former friend groups where excommunication was common. I have found community in the chats of streamers like Xan and Vosh specifically because I don't have to worry about not being perfect and losing my entire social network, an anxiety developed upon years of observation and some fear of abandonment to boot.
So here we have Luxander admitting to what I've been saying about Natalie Wynn and Buck Angel all along. That they're selling a mantra of zero accountability, and that's why Luxander was so quick to change. They literally tell us that the reason they moved to the Dirtbag left was because they were terrified of being held accountable for their actions. Something that's been demonstrated pretty aptly throughout all of this. What Luxander says here about excommunication is no less a red flag than when an MRA complains about how nobody can date anymore thanks to feminism. It's such a mischaracterization of what actually happens that the only reason a person would ever make such an argument is because that lie benefits them personally. Nobody is demanding perfection. I gave Woodford a month to sort his shit out. I gave Luxander more than a year to apologize. What we're demanding is accountability. Luxander encouraged someone to abuse me. That has never been addressed by them in a satisfactory way. If me pointing that out hurts them or their brand in any way at all, that is entirely on them and their actions. If you can't date because of growing awareness of sexual harassment, you are a predator. And if you're afraid of certain circles because of accountability, you are someone who cannot be trusted to do the right thing.
When Xan covered EOT, I was not comfortable with the way he talked about them. However, the underlying concept that Ethel is a victim of trauma who has turned that eye onto others rang fairly true to my previous observations of their behaviour. Given that I am not close with either of them, that I disagree with both of them, that I do not historically involve myself in these dramas, that I have no reason to believe I would be successful speaking to either of them, I'm distancing myself further from the situation. 2021. Now, the quoted tweet up top. Given our lack of relationship, and my discomfort with their behaviour overall, I did not talk to EOT at any point. The claim that I did something to them deserving of an apology is weird, to say the least. If I go name searching on twitter.com and find something mean, that's me hurting my own feelings. If they're in my mentions, you could say they directly hurt me, but if they're subtweeting, nah. The other interesting thing about the quoted tweet is that, for Ethel, this seems to be about power. I have at no point had any desire to make them beg on hands and knees for an apology, and their perception that that's the case is pretty telling.
I'm sorry, Luxander, you don't get to encourage someone to exploit my history as a victim of abuse repeatedly, only to claim that you don't, quote, involve myself in these dramas, end quote. Nobody dragged them into my issues with Xanderhal. Nobody but themselves. They chose to encourage him to hurt me. They chose to tokenize themselves for him. Those are their actions. Actions that have not just hurt me, but many other trans people. They owe a lot of fucking apologies at this point. And I mean sincere ones, not these bullshit, I'm sorry if you took offense ones. As for the power involved here, I already read out the response in which Luxander stated, and I do quote, EOT didn't talk to me before publicly calling me an abuser/enabler, end quote, and quote, not even a, hey, what the fuck, end quote. But elaborating on that, Luxander fucked up. They inflicted harm. The initiative is on them to fix things. Words are cheap, and I was never going to trust an apology I had to ask for. The closest I'd allow myself was noting the fact that they hadn't apologized in a place they see, in hopes that they'd take a fucking hint. Another thing that Levi pointed out was the way in which Luxander argues that they couldn't approach me because they're apparently afraid of me due to my criticism of transphobia and abuse apologetics, and that's presented as a valid excuse. And yet, in the same thread, they pretend like it isn't a valid excuse for me to not come to them for an apology out of fear when they actually hurt me. Also, let's just be honest here, if I had approached them around that time in any manner besides one that strokes their fucking ego, keeping in mind I had literally witnessed them encouraging a transphobe to psychologically abuse me, they not only would have used that as justification for withholding an apology, they would have used the slightest hint of anger as evidence for their claims that I'm dangerous. So really, the only way for me to avoid that, outside of kissing their ass for encouraging someone to abuse me, is for me to shut up and say nothing about said behaviour. it's clear that I'm never going to get a benevolent response from them. At this point, the best they can do is start dismantling the bullshit they spread in regards to Xanderhal, the Dirtbag left, and cancel culture because, let's be real, that's what they mean by excommunicated. I am never going to fucking forgive them at this point, but that doesn't absolve them of their responsibility to undo the damage they are responsible for. Not for my sake, but for the sake of the trans community they turn their back on in exchange for a vain desire for personal glory and zero accountability.
The truth of the situation is that Ethel scares me, and it is her power in these spaces that I've been effectively hiding from for a year and a half, since before the screenshots she's using to discredit me. The power she has over people's perceptions of me stopped me from saying anything, thinking it was safer to just hide. I made and ultimately scrapped a video following up about the ACA drama because it included criticism of her. If you think I'm a shitty person for hanging out in a stream chat while discussing someone I think is harmful, I don't have any defense. If you think I'm a shitty person for not making callouts, I don't have any defense, and I still won't do it. I'm an abuse survivor who just wants to fucking live in peace. I'm working through my issues and growing as a person, mindful that my trauma is not an excuse to be shitty to other people, and I can't be around people who aren't introspective about that. As you can see, it would have probably gone pretty badly to have said all this a year ago, which is why I didn't. It was obvious that people wouldn't support me. I don't want to be involved, and I haven't wanted to be involved, which is why I didn't involve myself. I just want people to have access to my point of view. Judge me as you will.
So as expected by now, we have the usual downplay of their role in Xanderhal's abuse. It seems that Luxander is under the impression that if they say they had no part in what happened enough times to enough people, that will magically make it true. Thankfully, reality doesn't work that way. I mean, the whole, which is why I didn't involve myself, is just a flat out lie. And we have the video evidence to back that up. Another thing we see here is something that's been present throughout the thread, but has always been very subtle. I'd like to read out 3 quotes, side by side, to show you what I mean. Quote 1.
As an abuse survivor myself, now officially diagnosed with PTSD, I can understand Ethel's desire to help people who are faced with injustice. And also as an abuse survivor, I identified them as a person who I couldn't safely publicly criticize or affiliate with.
Quote 2.
When Zan covered EOT, I was not comfortable with the way he talked about them. However, the underlying concept that Ethel is a victim of trauma who has turned that eye onto others rang fairly true to my previous observations of their behavior.
Quote 3.
I'm an abuse survivor who just wants to fucking live in peace. I'm working through my issues and growing as a person, mindful that my trauma is not an excuse to be shitty to other people, and I can't be around people who aren't introspective about that.
Again, these are spaced out to reduce their impact, but once you put them side by side, what Luxander is doing becomes obvious. The reason they say they personally weren't a fan of the way Xanderhal talked about me, rather than declaring his actions outright harmful, is because they themselves are doing the same thing. They're attempting to draw a connection between my criticism of them and my history as a survivor of abuse, in an attempt to discredit said criticism. They are pathologizing my actions. It doesn't matter what Luxander's personal experiences are. They still don't have the right to exploit my history of trauma in an attempt to pathologize my criticism, a standard that had been made very clear by this point. But they chose to anyway, meaning that Luxander not only encouraged Xanderhal to armchair diagnose me, violating me in the process, Luxander also chose to double down and violate me for a second time when I called them out on their part in all of this. What's important to add to all this is the fact that I'd already publicly discussed how I'd not only received professional support for my history as a victim of abuse, but I talked to my therapist about my interactions online due to the constant narrative surrounding them. And I'd already explained how my therapist, the person who actually knows me, did not agree with either Xanderhal or Luxander. I was not merely lashing out because of my history as a survivor of abuse. I was reacting to people inflicting tangible harm, both on me and my community. That's a healthy response. Now, the last thing I really want to focus on is just how glaring the transmisogyny is at this point, specifically in relation to the statement that
The truth of the situation is that Ethel scares me, and it is her power in these spaces that I've been effectively hiding from for a year and a half, since before the screenshots she's using to discredit me.
Well, what power? Again, here's more of that vagueness I was referring to earlier. The only thing Luxander acknowledges are the screenshots, i.e. the tangible proof of Luxander's own actions, which shows a key difference in how we operate, namely the fact that I back up what I say with actual evidence. But that's apparently too much. The reality is, I don't have some sort of mystical power in the trans community. In fact, a lot of binary trans people hate my guts because I have the audacity to call out their queen. I don't have a cult of personality. I haven't spent years lying, pretending to be this soft person who could do no wrong. The only one here with that sort of power is Luxander. I am a trans femme non-binary person, assigned male at birth, who has wholeheartedly rejected assimilationist culture and therefore will always be presumed to be a monster. And I am going up against another non-binary person who is weaponizing the softness they've cultivated for years, all as a means to avoid criticism for their actions. There's a reason Luxander's posts were getting hundreds of hearts, whilst mine were not. I know that I'm at a great disadvantage. I know my anger throughout this video, as perfectly reasonable as it is, all things considered, will be taken as further evidence against me. But that would be the case no matter what I say. I ended the science portion of my original response to Rationality Rules by telling him that, and as a result, many of the transphobic elements of your audience are going to feel emboldened. They're going to ramp up the abuse on people like me because of your failure. So I expect you to have the decency to do the right thing. Prove me wrong on the alt-like remark. Prove to me that you are better than that. Because from watching the rest of your video, I really question that. A lot of what is said is not just factually wrong, it's unnecessarily hostile and dehumanizing towards trans people. And yet, that was deemed too aggressive. It's almost like my critics don't focus on what I say, only who is saying it. So why should I refrain from a few F-bombs in regards to the person who not only encouraged a rampant transphobe to exploit my trauma, but did so themselves? I will never be seen as respectable. And honestly, I'm becoming okay with that. I know the sort of people I attract to my community. It's not the well-off, well-spoken among us. It's the most downtrodden. Those who feel like they're being crushed, not just by larger society, but by the very movements that claim to fight for them. And they're the people who need the most support. So on that note, fuck respectability, fuck the dirtbag movement, and if you're watching this, Luxander, fuck you for your part in supporting the continued violence against our trans siblings. You are a token, nothing more than a class traitor to trans people everywhere. Something to be disposed of the moment you outlive your usefulness to the people you surround yourself with. It's kind of poetic. you've run to the very thing you're afraid of. Have fun with that. So with this video finally done and out of the way, all that leaves us with in this series is my coverage of Riley Grace Rochon, including the way in which she targeted me, using a recent death in my family to really twist the knife. It's gonna be a hell of a ride, so please consider subscribing and sticking around for that. If you have any questions or criticism, do post them below. Just know that abuse won't make it through. If you like what we do here, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Vorst, Sroy and Katie, Cthulhu, and Sosh Daniels. And for myself, Udita and Levi, take care now.